Awesome. So let's get started. I'm going to pause the music. So hello, my name is Marco. I work at and today we're going to be talking about collaborative learning. And this is really the conversation about how do you share tribal knowledge once you have things that don't fit in a doc. And what we mean by that is that it's either constantly changing, so a doc would be stale by the time it's written, or it's too complex. It requires context. So it's not micro in nature. So it's hard to just write down into a document. So with that, I'll tell you a little bit about the backstory and why I'm telling this story to begin with. So back in the day, I was at, I had a software training company. We would go to large tech organizations like Intel, Cisco, Qualcomm, Motorola, DoD, etc. And we would train their engineers on cutting edge open source technologies, things like Java, Scala, Hadoop, Android, you name it, things that were at the cutting edge, and these organizations needed their engineers to get up to speed quickly with that. And at the time, Twitter approached us and basically said, hey, you know, we, as everyone else in the industry, are trying to become mobile first. This is 2013. So this is a pre-IPO, much smaller organization. And they wanted to basically retool their entire Eng org, which is about half of the people. And so they brought us in, they acquired a company, and we built Twitter University. And really quickly, we realized that the biggest challenge Twitter had was not what we call now vanilla knowledge. It wasn't about this external stuff. It was about things that are internal to the organization. So how Twitter works and how we work at Twitter. And we were the last people to be able to share that knowledge because we were noobs to the company. So we needed to enable other people to share that. So through that, we basically created a concept. We called it peer learning at the time. Now we refer to it more in industry more as a collaborative learning. But basically the idea was to enable others to share knowledge among themselves. So that's kind of the backstory of how we learned the ropes, at least. I just wanted to point out that a lot of these stories come from industry leaders, and you know, so while I have firsthand experience at Twitter, we also run a community called Technicon, and through that we capture stories from people from other tech companies, from Spotify to Credit Karma to Uber to LinkedIn, et cetera, Netflix, to just name a few. So you'll be, this is a cross section of things that we've observed. I'll be sharing this deck with you afterwards, but the links to the stories are available here as well. So if you click on this, it's going to open it up, and you would actually see the full story as well. So that's a little bit about where you can get more of from the experts who've actually done this before. I mentioned Technicon, so a lot of this would not be possible without this community that we helped start about 3 years ago, 3-4 years ago, along with LinkedIn and Salesforce leads, technical knowledge sharing leads. And now it's about 1,000 members strong. We have meetings every month ongoingly, and we usually hear stories from people like yourselves telling their experiences building knowledge sharing programs within their organizations, usually very innovative organizations. The talk that's coming up in October is from Chris Schaefer, who leads engineering education for all of Microsoft. And just for context, Microsoft has about 100,000 engineers, and they onboard about 1,000 a month. So talk about scale. Chris has seen it all. So he's going to be talking about lessons learned there in October. And Tomomi just shared a link in the chat where you can learn more and sign up for that talk. So that's going to be super fun. Looking forward to that. So we talk about tech enablement. I just kind of wanted to kind of put an umbrella over it. So it's a combination of various things that make up knowledge sharing or delivering on a promise of, you know, come here and you'll be able to do your best work possible. So things that we usually see under this umbrella are things like technical onboarding. So how do you get people up to speed, general knowledge sharing, collaborative peer learning, which is what we're going to talk about today, mentorship, coaching, buddy system, office hours, tech docs, and also measuring metrics and getting insights and kind of justifying and kind of honing your programs in. So today we're focused on collaborative learning. I just wanted to mention that we do have webinars on other topics as well. So if any of this is of interest, we either have it scheduled or it's becoming scheduled. So just kind of heads up. There is a talk coming up in October, I believe October 13th, that I'll be doing on leadership, immersive leadership development with respect to technical folks. So Tomomi will share a link for that as well. So with that, let's get to this. So that was just a little bit of a background. So collaborative, aka peer learning. What do we mean by that? These are some definitions that I sort of picked up from Wikipedia, just to kind of compare the notes if we're on the same page. But essentially, the idea is that people are learning something together, and they're doing so because they are trying to get to the same level of so-called shared understanding, right? So what we noticed is that most innovative companies, to be able to innovate at that scale, you want everyone to have the same understanding of how we work and how the place works, right? And so to do that, there are a couple of ways you can do that. You could obviously create a lot of documentation, you could create videos, you can create e-learning, etc., etc. All of those things have their own pros and cons. Today, we're talking about collaborative learning, which is usually based on live micro, usually 1 or 2 hour workshops and sessions that are quick and dirty. And there's a reason for that, so that we can spin them up inexpensively from very experts whose job is not to teach, but they're the key holders of knowledge. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So, so what is the challenge? Well, innovative organizations tend to build a secret sauce. They tend to develop things internally that is very unique to them and how they operate. And the longer they exist, there's more internal tools, internal frameworks, internal processes, etc., best practices. So that's one challenge. You're building your own secret sauce, which by definition is not available outside of the building. So it's hard to find polished book or course or video outside of the company on that thing that you built internally. So that's a challenge number one. Challenge number two is that as you scale, and most innovative companies are on a rapid growth trajectory, the more people you have, the number of connections between those people grows quadratically. So the more people, the much exponentially bigger problem you have. And so that in itself is a problem. How do you now connect the dots and make sure that noobs, aka new people, have the same understanding of your best practices as the old timers that have been there for a while? And so that's one of the challenge that that we see internally at companies like this. So when we started working at Twitter, I experienced this firsthand. So basically, it was a handful of us. I believe my team was about 5 or 7 people at the time, and Twitter had roughly about 2,000 engineers. And so the challenge was, how do we go from how do we make an impact? How do we share knowledge from a handful of us and enable thousands to do that? And so a couple of insights that we had is, first of all, we realized that it was about internal knowledge, so not external. So we were not in business of procuring training from outside of the company. We were in the business of enabling internal experts to share themselves. So that was the first thing. And then one of the insights that kind of positively surprised me was that experts were willing to share themselves if we made it easy for them. So there was a general willingness to contribute, but at the same time, people didn't want to deal with the toil work of organizing classes and scheduling and registrations and all that stuff. So if we made it easy, they would come. Essentially, was the lesson learned there. So what we did is we came up with this framework, and it's essentially a six-part framework, and this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So the framework basically goes, starts here at 12 o'clock. So uncovering pain, figuring out who are the experts and how to sell them on the idea of teaching and sharing themselves, in how to do that, so that it fits into their workflow, because they obviously have other work to do as well. How to enable them to do that well, how to promote the internal classes, how to measure what's working, what's not, and then how to rinse and repeat and get better and keep doing this as an upward spiral. Just want to mention that also we have seen, when done well, that this becomes quite easily a upward spiral, meaning you start small and people see the benefit of it, and more people start coming to you and saying, hey, we would like this for my team or my internal customers and so on. And it kind of becomes a thing on its own and scales. At Twitter, within 1 year, it became the highest rated program for engineers. We had something like 100,000 student hours, 10,000 student hours. We had 1 in 5 engineers regularly teaching classes. So we had a few hundred experts contribute to the program on an ongoing basis. So it scaled up quite rapidly within the first year. So that's the framework. So we're going to start with step 1. Which is uncover pain. So basically, what do you start? And when we got to Twitter, we were basically trying to figure out like what was broken, where to start. There was a lot of different systems, lots of different things. I would ask people, and at that point, Twitter was so big that nobody could quite wrap their head around everything that comprises it, right? My direct manager at the time, he was a head of platform, and he basically said, well, if you asked me a year ago, I could draw a map of how things work. I can't do that anymore, and I don't think anybody can, right? We had about 1,000 different services and many different projects and so on. So it was a little bit of a gnarly beast. So what we started doing is we started looking at what are the systems that are used by the most. So essentially, I was looking at what's the cross-section of things that impact most engineers, right? And as such, is presumably, if poorly understood, would have the biggest bang for the buck. So we found certain things that were obvious. For example, we have a build tool that only Twitter uses called Pants. We had a library called Finagle that, again, was homegrown, that is not available outside of the building as much. So thus we depended on internal understanding of how that works. So that was another one. So I started basically figuring out those hypotheses, what might be at the core of everyone's kind of workflow. And then I started looking for complaints. What are people complaining about? And there are a couple of ways to do that. I could talk to people, or I could do a survey. So I started owning quarterly surveys, and I would basically just, Google Forms, send out a survey to 1,000 engineers and start asking, like, hey, what's your biggest impediment? And started discovering some really interesting patterns. There were patterns about what is in their way, but there were also the patterns about what it costs, right? So for example, we came up with some number that we could justify. Around 40% of engineers' time was spent on either asking for questions to be answered, or answering the same question over and over again through email or Slack. And so obviously that was an impediment that was not counted anywhere. Their managers had no idea that there's like such a waste built into the system, right? Because everyone was dealing with that localizedly. So that was one issue that was very interesting and useful piece of data. I started also looking at the data such as code commits, code reviews, incident reports, etc., to figure out, are there any patterns? This proved to be much noisier than I expected. I was first very excited that we had data, but then I was a little bit overwhelmed by not too much data and not being able to find any meaningful patterns. So there was that. And then ultimately, partnering with managers was very fruitful because ultimately I would need their people, their engineers, to spend time not writing code, but explaining how the code works, right? And so obviously this is an ask from an engineering manager, and it can be a tough ask. I usually, when I do these webinars, somebody always raises a hand and says, well, how do we get people to teach if that's not their job? Their job is to write code. This is exactly the point. But I would partner with their managers, and I would use the data to justify, hey, did you know that your engineers are spending so much time on the same support over and over again? We could alleviate that by having a solid, for example, a class or workshop on how to properly use this, for the best practices for that, et cetera, et cetera. So once they started realizing that, they started knocking on our doors and said, hey, we would like to partner up and develop classes. So that was an awesome insight. So going through uncovering pain, one of the things that I don't want to underestimate is the power of onboarding. So this tends to be a low-hanging fruit. So many of you either have programs for onboarding or are thinking about this. So usually it starts here. And sometimes it's separate than collaborative learning, and we have a separate workshop on technical onboarding altogether. But I just wanted to call it out here because at least at Twitter, it didn't start as, hey, let's build this beautiful onboarding. Rather, it started as somebody putting a hodgepodge of what engineers needed to know. So we needed to know how to check out code, how to be on call, how to, the overarching architecture, et cetera, et cetera. So it became basically a kitchen sink of various micro classes taught by different volunteers internally. So that's how we started, but it's worthwhile turning towards onboarding and paying attention. Ultimately, the promise of onboarding, and we're not going to talk about too much of this here. Like I said, there's a separate webinar altogether, but the promise was for new hires to know how your tech stack works. So how does Twitter work? And then how do we work at Twitter, for example, right? So that was what we needed to deliver. So there's both this like technical aspect as well as social agreements on how teams work. That was important and neglected for a long time, and it was impeding people's ability to be nimble and develop faster and so on. So that's what we focused on. So just wanted to kind of mention that here as one thing. So great, you do a bunch of talking to people, looking data, doing surveys, and you sort of build your hypothesis of like, this tool is poorly understood, that's poorly understood. Let's kind of now solve for that. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is identifying who are the experts. Who are the people internally who have this key knowledge, who you want to partner with, put on a pedestal, and have them be the presenters of that knowledge. So usually those are your most valuable engineers. So there's this trick of we want them to do presentations and workshops, yet they're the most valuable. So how do you go about that? Couple of insights. People love to contribute. So especially engineers, technical folks, they gravitate toward loving to share their knowledge. Again, they just want to make it, you just want to make it easy for them. Otherwise, they're going to probably back off. So that's one insight. Great software engineer is not necessarily a great presenter. There's another insight behind this. If I would ask a great engineer, what does a great workshop look like for them? They would usually say something along the lines of, we get to down and dirty very quickly. So it's usually like work on a piece of code, hands-on, open up a laptop, let's go and let's build something. That's what a great experience is for them. Now, if you ask the same person, hey, go build a workshop, right? What they are going to do is they're going to turn towards Google Slides and start creating slides, which is exactly the thing they dislike as attendees. So there's this sort of asymmetry between what they value and how they approach it. And so this is what coaching them becomes essentially our job, right? To help them create great presentations that are also simple for them to do and work with. And I also mentioned teaching is not necessarily their job. So how do you enable them to be great at that and do that part-time and do it as a very small tax on their time? So where do you go for ideas, who to talk to? So a couple of people that I would typically interview is I would start with old-timers. So people who've seen the organization scale, who've experienced problems over time. So that arc that they've seen. So that's the good place to start. They're often individual contributors. And sometimes they may be more senior, but it's not necessarily always the case. Another place is leadership. So leadership has an insight into what might be not working, even though their insight can usually be biased and not based on data. So I would just put like an asterisk on when asking leadership. I would nod to them, but I would not necessarily take that at face value because they bring their own bias to the equation. Platform owners, if your organization is big enough and you have somebody owning sort of the lower level components, is usually a good place. So these are the people that are providing building blocks to everyone else. So for example, a company like Twitter, for example, we had people that build the building blocks, and then we had the people at the upper level, developers at the upper level that build the actual app and user-facing features. And it was usually the lower was more important, and the reason for that is that the lower level developers were serving more internal customers. So they were serving app developers. So as such, they wanted to contribute and teach the app developers. So that's why even my team was based in the platform engineering. And there's also squeaky wheels. So people who like to complain or who care about certain problems. So they're also a good source of data. I would just, kind of, again, take it with a grain of salt because they're just that, they're squeaky wheel in the equation. So sometimes they have great insights, but just, don't over count on that or over bias on that. So great. So now we have people and we identify them. What we want is to help them build great presentation. It's usually a presentation because, like I said, a document is likely going to be out of date by the time it's written, and that's how we're turning towards collaborative learning. We'll talk about tech docs in a separate webinar. There's a time and place for that, but this is a different use case. So when building a workshop, I would start with a promise. Like, assuming people come, it's X, what is the Y that you want to take them to? So for example, one of my early workshops was on Android development. So, and I had multiple such workshops. So the starting promise was, Java, right? So that was your prerequisite, Java. And the promise was you will be able to build a basic Android app. So that was kind of how we defined it. And so then later on, we had other sort of journeys, right? So now that you know to build basic Android app, we'll teach you how to build Android app at Twitter using our frameworks and tools. And so the promise of the delta was clear. And then identify the key points and fill in the content. So it's kind of building it, laying it horizontally as layers of high resolution, higher density, versus going horizontally. So, for example, and I had this argument with my book publisher at one point, O'Reilly Media. They would like to see chapter 1 done and then move to the chapter 2, whereas I was thinking about the book first as hey, let's do an outline and let's put a little bit of a, bullet points, and let's lay some content, and let's say lay more English on top of that. And so I was kind of laying layers horizontally versus doing vertical fully complete chapters. And so I found that worked much better for me to kind of iteratively develop content. So when we also talk about what it looks like when it's all said and done, we usually lean on mini or micro classes, so usually 1 to 2 hours in length. So we're not necessarily doing initially very long experiences. And the reason for this is that you can A, communicate a lot in an hour or two. B, it's a much smaller ask for a expert. So if I'm going to knock at the door of a senior architect in the company, if I just say, hey, can you use, once a month, do 1 hour kind of whiteboarded session on how all the microservices fit together, that's a much smaller ask than saying, hey, can you go and develop this fully fledged, polished, beautiful, like e-learning course? Like that is a much bigger ask that's probably never going to happen because they have so many other responsibilities. But just saying, go whiteboard something quick and dirty, that's good enough. So stressing good enough again versus polished, right? So we're optimizing purposely for something that's just going to work for what we need. So basically, much easier, much lower ask, lower tax on your experts, and people usually tend to raise their hand and say that's reasonable, and I'm willing to do that. So again, just to kind of sum this up, just like any good movie or drama or a novel, you want to have sort of like a sense of a through line. So people start at some point. So for example, knowing Java, they end at some point. For example, knowing how to build an Android app, right? So there's a delta, and so there's a discrepancy creates a good drama, creates the tension, creates the pull for them to want to learn or to learn this. And the way I sort of think about this main idea, so all the things that you need to learn in this journey is a stumbling obstacles, right? So it's like, oh, you want to build a UI for that app. Whoops, you don't know how to do that. Let's talk about that. Okay, now you want to add networking to that app. Whoops, how do you do that? Now you want to add a database so you can save stuff locally. How do you do that? Et cetera, et cetera. So kind of built this as obstacles that are a natural progression of where we're working on a longer arc of building something. And usually, if this is something that's tangible and real and easy to understand, the more interesting that presentation is. So, for example, my Android course, my bootcamp, was about building an app that was basically a microblogging app. So you would kind of have all these things illustrated en route through the class as you learn various concepts of, say, Android. All right, so we're on step 4 out of 6. So basically now you have your course, you identify the problems, you identified who can do it, you coach them on how to do it. And this coaching could be half-an-hour meetings here and there with your key experts and kind of helping them guide them. And now you have an outline of a course. You may not have a full course. And one of the things, as a matter of fact, we learned is that we may not necessarily want to have the full course fully built out, because sometimes what the course was just a hunch. We did not have evidence that it would actually work. So what we would do is we would put a quote unquote a poster for a course. This was obviously in the system, digital and all that, but it provided for a way to say, here's a course, it's coming up, it's a month from now, sign up. And that would give us enough information about how valuable and interesting this is, so that we can get people to kind of sign up, and that would give us the feedback information on that. So you gauge the interest. We would promote it, would use swag. We would use internal customers to help target the courses and so on. Next came up measuring. So now presumably you built that first version of a course, you launched it, your expert whiteboarded it, presented it, it was good enough, but how do you know if it was good enough? What do you optimize for, right? What's the feedback loop? And so a couple of things that we measured, we thought about this and we focused on volume, quality, and impact. So when it comes to volume, we simply said, let's think about butts in seats, right? And so the idea was, presumably we have, everyone's an adult. These are, smart engineers, smart technical folks, right? And they came here to do their best work. They are motivated to build something great. And our courses, our education is really just a tool for them to be unblocked, unstuck, so they can run faster and do great work, right? So, so if that's true, then they're voting with their time. If they're coming into our class, our workshop, they're voting with the time and saying, yes, this is valuable to me, right? So that's why butts in seats was actually a good proxy, and we measured that. And like as I mentioned, we had, on a good month, we would have about 10,000 student hours for, population of about 2,000 engineers. So you can kind of do the math. Some people would take more than the others, so obviously. The next one was quality. So how do we know that? So great, maybe they're saying we need X, but it doesn't mean that X is good, right? So how do we know if it's good? How do we know that we actually delivered on what we teased or promised, right? So we turned toward Kirkpatrick's a scale, which is what in learning and development industry is pretty popular. And just like everyone else, we realized that one was very easy. So getting that smiley sheet, how much do you like it, yeah or nay? We used NPS. So that was something that was very easy. And our NPS would run in the 60s. So that was at the level of like Apple and Nike, for example. So it was a very good NPS. People really enjoyed the classes. But that doesn't mean that they actually retained it, right? So we actually did not do much to measure Kirkpatrick level 2. And the reason for that is we just didn't have ability, systems, willingness. These are micro classes, and we're like, you know what, we're just gonna deliberately skip number 2 on Kirkpatrick. We did look at behavior and results. So did they use what they learned in work, and did it impact their team, their business, their department, etc.? So the number 3, we would basically send them a survey 3 months, 1 month out, 30 days out, and say, hey, you learn about Android. Are you using it in your day-to-day, or was this just so nice to know? And the number 4 is level 4 is we would ping their managers maybe 90 days out, so 3 months later, and say, hey, Charlie on your team took class on Android. Curious how him knowing that is helping your team run faster. So that's kind of how we went about Kirkpatrick and measuring quality. And then impact is really a lot of people getting a lot of value, right? So so that's kind of how we thought about that. So quality times volume was our impact, and so that's what we kind of optimized for. So with that, the final step was rinse and repeat. So how do we now get this flywheel to spin faster? We just did we started with maybe half a dozen workshops, 1 hour each, very micro, kind of just started, roll the ball out. And that sometimes is enough to kind of create this upward spiral of things just getting organically better and better. But we thought we would be intentional about this. So a couple of things that we did is we started with a handful of classes. Very quickly, we got into hundreds of classes, right? So this became now a new nightmare to deal with. We had online classes in person. We had videos, articles, code labs, self-paced, etc., etc. So how do we organize all this, make sense of it, and all that? So one of the things we did is we came up with naming conventions. So like, for example, overview sessions, so overview of Android. You knew that was a lean back slide-based experience. So any promise to just give you a high-level understanding. Taste of was the opposite. It was no slides. It was code first, but you may not know the components. You may not have the true understanding. At least you got a taste of what it feels like if you wanted to go further. And then we had essentials that it turned out to be a multi-day classes. We would build them out of components over time, and that was delivering a much longer arc of getting to know something, like, for example, knowing everything Android around Android, and then boot camps for, say, onboarding or leadership training. So that's kind of how we started organizing and making sense of a lots of content. And then we started having lots of experts. Like I mentioned, we had about 1 in 5, so a few hundred people regularly teaching classes. So how do we know who's working well, who's not? And so, and what do we need teaching and coaching them? So having feedback loops, having basically people tell us, or participants tell us this worked or this didn't, was a signal to my team to go out and provide coaching where coaching was needed, so that we can up level where we needed to help experts become better presenters. We would start capturing those best practices. We would organize expert meetups. So once a month, we would people who taught classes all the time, so engineers, they would come together and among themselves share best practices, what works, what didn't, right? And through that, everyone learned and got better. And then remote offices. So as many, and this is pre-pandemic, many tech companies are very lopsided toward HQ. So we really quickly realized that we need to also worry about distributed offices, or just kind of worrying about teams globally in general. And so we started working with ambassadors in other time zones, other locations, places that were just too far off for us to have an impact. And so so that was useful, thinking through that and navigating that. Couple of things I wanted to mention. This evolution of peer learning or building a program like this is not very linear. Like you have a mini success, and then things break apart, and then you have to stop, rejiggle things. Then you have another success, and you kind of go from one plateau and local maximum, only to discover a problem, go to another plateau, local maximum, and you have to retool again, and so on and so on. Ultimately, you get this beautiful culture where people are just learning from one another, and it becomes a positive, reinforcing, self-feeding loop. So that was a really great. We were very grateful to kind of get to that point over time. So that was pretty cool. So with that, I just wanted to show you what this, I know we have a couple of minutes, so what this might look like. So this is just on Plus platform, and I'm going to just go to events because this is mostly live learning, and I'm going to switch to engineering so you can kind of see that. But in a typical company, and this is what it may look like at a company such as Netflix or LinkedIn or Salesforce, or some smaller startups as well. You usually identify what are the core things that you need your engineers to know. So for example, how do we do on-call, or what's the general security for engineers? And this could be an hour or two presentation taught by a head of, say, InfoSec, that happens once a month, and it could happen in person or online. And so being able to market a course like this, having people easily register or request an event if the time and place doesn't work for them, so that you can now have a signal that maybe PST is not the only time zone that works, et cetera, et cetera. So this was very, very useful. So we had a way to create a bunch of classes like this, and allow anyone, as a matter of fact, fully democratize, so that at some point anyone can throw a class and say, well, I'm very motivated to teach about leadership for technical teams, or I know a lot about CI/CD and I want to teach about that. So our experts started standing up their own workshops and classes, and so that was very fulfilling to see that approach. And we as a team would then be talk about peer leadership and so on. So different teams own different classes, and over time the wealth of these offerings just became large, and that was very impactful. And then on the tail end, because we were running on a platform, we had a way to kind of track what's working, what's not, where are people signing up, etc., etc. So that's basically what that may look like when it's all said and done. With that, I just wanted to leave a couple of moments for questions, and I see one from Lynn. Lynn calls out, the technical staff may not be the best presenters, facilitators. Using your L&D staff to present may be useful. Yeah, so we used our L&D staff not to present, but to coach presenters, because what we realized is that we don't know we're not experts on Jenkins, on on Kubernetes, on call, on this and that. So rather than doing that, we wanted to enable actual experts who knew things very well to be that, but we wanted to also make it as simple for them as possible. So, for example, our data science was taught by the team that ran data science, right? They were the smartest people on the planet. I had no business in teaching that, but so I would work with them, yes, coach them to become great presenters, and make it as small ask as possible. Like I said, over time it became 1 or 2 hours a month. So we're talking about very minimal ask. If there was something that was too repetitive and stable, like, so it's not changing, such as onboarding over time, or certain things become stable and now it's kind of boring to teach it. You don't really need the expert to keep repeating themselves. You have a couple of choices. One is bottle it into a video, right? So stable things, we would then bottle into videos, and we would basically then, it may look like, here's introduction to Docker, or this is how we do microservices with Kafka. So you no longer need to keep repeating yourself, so you just tape it. Or my team would own certain things that were cutting many concerns. So onboarding was one thing that would cut many concerns. So my team would pull back and say, we want to own that, but everything else we're going to democratize and push to the edges of, we're going to enable edges of the organization to be the experts and so on. So that's that was our approach to that. So great question, Lynn. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns? And by the way, I'll be reaching out to you via email as well, with a deck and to see, what resonated, what you're working on, etc. Compare notes. But any questions for the great of the whole? So there was a question for Yanlin. Any tips on getting organizational buy-in if the minimum viable product, one to our classes is hard to drive changes, is quantifiable and measurable. From my past experience, getting good NPS score is not enough to convince leadership. Yeah, NPS score may not be. One of the things that we've seen, I'll share a story from LinkedIn. And by the way, all these stories are also available, like I mentioned, in ideas. So if you go collaborative learning, and this is going to be in the deck as well, there's a lot of stories from companies like Uber, Twitter, Splunk, Spotify, etc. So they've all gone through something like this. Now, what we've seen is things like collaborative learning usually starts at the grassroots level. So at LinkedIn, it started by one staff engineer, Stepan, organizing this workshops. Sorry, it was Bentley. And then it kind of exploded, and then and more people wanted to do tech talks. It was tech talks, and so it just kind of started organically. And all of a sudden, like, he's like, "Oh my God! Like, I have hundreds of these things, and I'm like, this requires a full management." And so he pointed leadership to that. Like, look, people are voting with their time. They're obviously finding this tech talk super valuable as a way to share knowledge and inspire one another. And so maybe we need to hire a program manager to do this, or have somebody own this, part-time. Then there are companies like Spotify. This is a great story. Again, I encourage you to read it. But Spotify discovered that through collaborative learning, they unleash innovation. So that's obviously top of mind for leadership, right? They want their people to be innovative. And so by connecting the dots, ideas collide and have babies, right? And that's what unlocks innovation. And so Spotify noticed that and invested in that. So yeah, so thanks, Darren. Yeah, I'll follow up with you and see how, there are ways to start this, like I said, grassroots inexpensively. It doesn't need to take a long time or have a lot of buying either. So Claire says, any ideas on how to start an organized training culture in a company? A lot of siloed info, people needing onboarding, and it is happening though through a lot of office hours and Zoom talks. Yeah, so it sounds like you have bits and pieces, you have raw ingredients. How do you put that in one place so that it's discoverable? Like I said, one of the things that we found is that in many companies this is happening. Our big thing was put all that, make it in one place, and then it becomes, the scale goes up 10x because it's all now in one place. I can find all various leadership classes, onboarding things, engineering things. I'm just going to giving you an example, but people can now figure out, okay, you know, I want to discover that. So by organizing it and centralizing it and making discovery easy and collecting data so that you have a feedback loop, how well things are going, that really helped. Kind of in our case. So, and we are seeing this across the industry. So we saw this at Twitter, but we're seeing this across Silicon Valley companies. So it's a similar pattern over and again. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? If not, thank you. And like I said, we are going to be following up with you next in the next day or so, just to see if we can answer anything one-on-one. Office hours, you know, if you just want to chit chat, compare notes, happy to do that. And also we have Chris Schaefer from Microsoft speaking in October. How Microsoft does things at like the other extreme of scale, right? And then I'll be also doing a webinar on technical leadership training and how to organize that. So that's also coming up in October. The links are in the chat Tomomi shared. So with that, thank you, and great having everyone here.